I am so sick and tired of wars, and I'm ready for peace. What about you? Glad to hear it. But pretty much everybody is for peace, even the people who think the surest way to peace is through more wars. They have a peace pole in the Pentagon, after all. I'm pretty sure they ignore it more than worship it, although they do make a lot of human sacrifices for the cause. When I ask a room of people in this country if they think any side of any war could be justified or ever has been justified, 99 times out of 100 I quickly hear shouts of World War II or Hitler or Holocaust, the very war that used nuclear weapons. Now I'm going to do something I do not usually do and recommend that you watch a super long film by Ken Burns on PBS, the new one on the US and the Holocaust. I mean, unless you are one of those weirdo dinosaurs like me who reads books. Any of you read books? Okay, well, the rest of you, watch this film because it eliminates the number one reason people give for supporting the number one past war they support, which is the number one propaganda foundation for supporting new wars and new weapons. I expect book readers already know this, but saving people from death camps was not part of World War II. In fact, the need to focus on waging a war was the top public excuse for not rescuing people. The top private excuse was that none of the world's countries wanted the refugees. The film covers the insane debate that went on over whether to bomb death camps to save them, but it does not tell you that peace activists, people like you, were lobbying Western governments to negotiate for the freedom of the camp's intended victims. Negotiations were held successfully with Nazi Germany over prisoners of war, just as recently negotiations have been held successfully with Russia over prisoner exchanges and grain exports in Ukraine. The trouble was not that Germany wouldn't free people. It had been loudly demanding that anyone take them for years. The trouble was the U.S. government did not want to free millions of people. It considered a major inconvenience. And the trouble now is that the U.S. government does not want peace in Ukraine. I do hope that the U.S. will admit fleeing Russians and get to know them and like them so that we can work together with them before the U.S. gets to the point of instituting a draft. But while only a vocal minority in the U.S. wanted to help the victims of Nazism, by some measures, we now have in the U.S. a quiet majority wanting to end the slaughter in Ukraine. But we're not all quiet all the time, are we? There was a poll by Data for Progress of Washington's 9th Congressional District at the beginning of August that found 53% of voters said they would support the U.S. pursuing negotiations to end the war in Ukraine as soon as possible, even if it meant making compromises with Russia. One of many reasons that I believe that number can go up, if it hasn't already gone up, is that in the very same poll, 78% of voters said they were concerned about the conflict going nuclear. I suspect that the 25% or more who apparently worry about a war going nuclear but believe that's a price worth paying to avoid negotiating for peace, lack a completely comprehensive understanding of what nuclear war is, and have never spoken to a single person from the Marshall Islands. I think we have to go on trying every possible means of getting people to become aware of the dozens of near-miss accidents and confrontations, of how extremely unlikely it is that a single nuclear bomb will be launched rather than a great many in two directions. That the sort of bomb that destroyed Nagasaki is now merely the detonator for the sort of vastly larger bomb that nuclear war planners call small and usable. And how even a limited nuclear war would create a global crop-killing nuclear winter that could leave the living envying the dead. I understand that some people in and about Richland, Washington are trying to change some names of things and generally scale back the glorification of having produced the plutonium that massacred the people of Nagasaki. I think we should applaud that effort to undo celebration of a genocidal action. The New York Times recently wrote about Richland, but mostly avoided the key question. If it were true that bombing Nagasaki actually saved more lives than it cost, then it might still be decent for Richland to show some respect for the lives that were taken, but it would also be important to celebrate such a difficult accomplishment. But if it is true, as the facts seem to clearly establish, that the nuclear bombs did not save more than 200,000 lives, did not in fact save a single life, then celebrating them is simply evil. And with some experts believing that the risk of nuclear apocalypse has never been greater than it is right now in this moment, it does matter that we get this right. The Nagasaki bombing was actually moved up from August 11th to 9th, 1945, to decrease the likelihood of Japan surrendering before the bomb could be dropped. So whatever you think of nuking one city, when many of the nuclear scientists wanted a demonstration on an uninhabited area rather than the nuking of a city, it's hard to concoct a justification for nuking a second city. And in fact, there was no justification for destroying the first one. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey set up by the U.S. government concluded that, quote, certainly prior to December 31st, 45, and in all probability prior to November 1st, Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, and even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had ever been planned or contemplated. A dissenter who expressed that same view to the Secretary of War and, by his own account, to President Truman prior to the bombings was a guy named General Dwight Eisenhower. General Douglas MacArthur, prior to the bombing of Hiroshima, put together a press conference and announced that Japan had already been beaten. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral William D. Leahy, said, quite angrily in 49, quote, the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. President Truman justified the Hiroshima bombing not as speeding the end of a war, but as revenge against Japanese offenses. For weeks, Japan had been willing to surrender if it could keep its emperor. The U.S. refused that until after the bombs fell. So the desire to drop the bombs may have lengthened the war. We should be very clear that this claim that the bombs saved lives originally made slightly more sense than it does now, because it was about white lives. Now everyone is too embarrassed to include that part of the claim, but goes on making the basic claim anyway, even though murdering 200,000 people in a war that could be over if you would just end it is perhaps the very furthest thing imaginable from saving lives. It seems to me that schools, rather than using mushroom clouds for logos, should focus on doing a little bit better job of teaching history. And I mean all schools. Why do we believe in the end of the Cold War? Who taught us that the Cold War ended? The supposed ending of the Cold War never involved either Russia or the U.S. reducing its stockpiles below what it would take to destroy virtually all life on Earth multiple times. Not in the understanding of scientists 30 years ago, and certainly not now, when we know more about nuclear winter. The Cold War's supposed ending was a matter of political rhetoric and media focus, but the missiles didn't go away. The weapons never came off the missiles in the US and Russia as in China. Neither the US nor Russia ever committed to not starting a nuclear war. The Treaty on Non-Proliferation's commitment appears never to have been an honest commitment in Washington, D.C. I hesitate even to quote what it says for fear someone in Washington, D.C. will learn it exists and tear it up. But I'm going to quote a bit of it anyway. The treaty's parties committed to, quote, pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control, end quote. I would like the U.S. government to sign on to a lot of treaties, including treaties and agreements it has torn up, like the Iran Agreement, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and including treaties it has never signed, such as the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But none of them are as good as existing treaties that we could demand compliance with, such as the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which bans all war, or the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which requires complete disarmament of all weapons. Why do we have these laws on the books that are so much better than the things we even dream of legislating that we find it easy to accept the propaganda claim that they don't actually really exist, that we should believe our televisions rather than our own lying eyes? The answer, I think, is pretty simple. The peace movement of the 1920s was stronger than we can imagine, and the anti-war and anti-nuclear movement of the 1960s was pretty darn good as well. Both of those movements were created by ordinary people exactly like us, except with less knowledge and experience. We can do the same and better. But we need to get mad about nuclear madness. We need to act as if every speck of beauty and wonder on Earth were threatened with swift annihilation because of the buffoonish arrogance of some of the dumbest people alive. We really are dealing with madness. And that means that we need to explain what's wrong with it for those who will listen, while building a movement of political pressure for those who need to be pushed. Why is it madness to want the biggest, baddest weapons around purely to deter irrational foreigners from unprovoked attacks, like the one Russia was just so carefully provoked into? Presumably you all know that being provoked into something doesn't excuse doing it, but I'm probably required to say that anyway. Here are 10 quick reasons why wanting nukes is madness. 1, let enough years go by and the existence of nukes will kill us by accident. 2, let enough years go by and the existence of nukes will kill us all through the act of some lunatic. 3, there is nothing better that a nuclear weapon can do to deter anything than what a massive pile of non-nuclear weapons can do. But wait for number 4. Non-violent action has proven a more successful defense against invasions and occupations than the use of weapons. 5, threatening to use a weapon in order to never have to use it creates a high risk of disbelief, confusion, and actually using it. 6, employing large numbers of people to prepare to use a weapon creates momentum for using it, which is part of the explanation of what happened in 45. 7, Hanford, like many other places, is sitting on waste that some call an underground Chernobyl waiting to happen, and nobody has figured out a solution, but generating more waste is considered unquestionable by those in the grip of the madness. 8, the other 96% of humanity is no more irrational than the 4% in the United States, but no less so either. 9, when the Cold War can be restarted simply by choosing to notice that it never ended, and when it can turn hot in an instant, failing to radically change course is the definition of insanity. 10, Vladimir Putin, as well as Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, 2 Bushes, Richard Nixon, Dwight Eisenhower, and Harry Truman, has threatened to use nuclear weapons. These are people who believe in keeping their threats far more than in keeping their promises. The U.S. Congress openly claims the complete inability to stop a president. And according to a Washington Post columnist this week, we don't need to worry about Vladimir Putin's threats because the U.S. has just as many nukes as he does. the entirety of our world is not worth the gamble that some nuclear emperor in the US or Russia or somewhere else won't follow through on the threats. Madness has been cured many times, and nuclear madness need be no exception. Institutions that have lasted many years and which were labeled inevitable, natural, essential, and various other terms of similarly dubious import have been ended in various societies. These include cannibalism, human sacrifice, trial by ordeal, blood feuds, dueling, polygamy, capital punishment, slavery, and Bill O'Reilly's Fox News program.
My name is Rachel Hoffman. My mother is Marshallese and my father is Jewish, so that makes me a little bit of an exile. And I'll talk more about that. So I first want to acknowledge that we are here in Seattle, Washington, more honorably known as the Coast Salish lands. So I am here to plead for peace along with you and to share with you why nuclear weapons should have been banned a long time ago. And I'm going to share this through the perspective of the Marshallese people. So my maternal family are from the Marshall Islands of Mille, Anno, Liliep, Medjet, and Namurik. And these 5 island atolls that I just named were not considered islands that were exposed to nuclear radiation. And the nuclear radiation was fired through the tests that were violently detonated on our islands through the land, ocean waters, crops, animals, and their very own people. But the experts of the islands, the Marshallese, they know that we have all been touched by the nuclear radiation. The Marshall Islands consist of 1,200 small atolls and islets, and our atolls are gracefully lying upon craters that have been formed over finely aged inactive volcanoes. To give you an idea of an atoll, I can tell you about our capital island, Medjaro. It has about a strip of land that is 25 miles long. I'm sorry, I should say it's about 25 miles long. And it's circular, and like I said, it's a rim on top of an inactive volcano on a coral reef. And it is the largest city that we have in our nation. In the US, we are considered COFA citizens. So COFA stands for the Compact of Free Association, and we are considered non-immigrants. It allows our people to live and work in the US. COFA citizens include people from the Marshall Islands, as well as the Republic of Palau and the Federated States of Micronesia. In exchange of this non-immigrant status, the US uses parts of our islands for military strategic positioning. Excuse me. And although we have this non-immigrant status, our people have struggled with access to healthcare, certain jobs, and higher education, to say the very least. So the blockades have confined us in a very unique and uncomfortable position for people in our communities, where they rely on allies, community leaders, and just anyone who is willing to give their time. Today we have grassroots organizations that are guiding our families in the areas of food supplementation, healthcare access and advocacy, housing navigation, and so much more. In Snohomish County, our Marshallese leaders have a startup organization called the Marshallese Association of the North Puget Sound, and I wish they were here with me today. We estimate that about 10,000 Marshallese people reside in Snohomish, Skagit, King, and Pierce counties. Most of these families are facing extreme symptoms of what we call marginalization. And this takes place in healthcare facilities, in our housing crisis, in our schools. In fact, thousands of our kids are entering our elementary schools and exiting without a college degree. Within the past few decades, I'd say that less than 20 people who are Marshallese have a college degree. I refuse to sleep on these numbers, so I currently teach elementary students in Snohomish County and work closely with allies to combat these issues in schools. In my opinion, our future is indeed our hope to revitalize our communities in our area. Now, what does all of this have to do with the protest against nuclear weapons? Where do I even begin with that? When US gained control of our islands, it led directly to colonialism and imperialism over our islands. We were manipulated into believing and trusting that surrendering our islands to the US government would enhance the security for the whole entire world. This led to the most dangerous genocide that continues to affect every Marshallese in ways that I described earlier. But there's so much more. Nuclear tests were conducted in our islands from 1946 to 1958, as many of you know. And there were 67 weapons that were detonated, and that's equivalent to 1.6 Hiroshima bombs every day for 12 years. The Marshallese have a full understanding of how nuclear war affects the environment, and Dr. Holly Barker continues to say how it affects our health, our economy, and every aspect of our life. And I also want to just take a moment to thank her for spending so much time in her work and dedication to unveil the secrecy of US nuclear testing in our islands, along with our beloved Marshallese champions who shared their stories with her and spoke at length of their lived effects of nuclear war. Many of my elders remember seeing a bright orange sky when one of the 67 weapons wiped out a sustaining island nation called Bugani, who people now know of as a bathing suit or as SpongeBob's home, of which both sickeningly derive from this terrible event in US history. The Bravo bomb, detonated on March 1st, 1954, on Bugani Atoll, destroyed one of the most beautifully biodiverse islands in our nation within seconds. Within the first second of the detonation, a fireball formed 5 miles across the ocean and continued invisibly for 300 miles. A mushroom cloud rose to 47,000 feet and grew up to 7 miles in diameter in the span of 1 minute. It continued to grow for 10 minutes and then reached 130,000 feet and 62 miles in diameter at a rate of 100 meters per second. This was the moment when my elders and ancestors saw that red sky. When the kids ate the fallout that they thought was snow in Rongalap. And when Project 4.1 helped scientists understand how fallout and nuclear weapons affect the health of human beings. Are we still being observed today as our family members walk in and out of Harborview Hospital with cancers derived from this nuclear legacy? Perhaps many of you understand the lifespan of radioactive chemicals, and maybe you know about Bruna Dome in Eniwetok, where there is a leak of radioactive wastes seeping into the Pacific Ocean. And of course, much of our nuclear waste is buried under the Hanford nuclear waste site and leaking into the Columbia River. So we know about that half-life. But what you may not understand is the shredding of my cultural web as we lose one elder after another, all too quickly, as a result of nuclear weapons. And how many children have we lost through miscarriages how the joy has been robbed from our families as we rely on government subsidized programs in this country. This is not who we are. We have been displaced first from nuclear testing, and now we are facing the reality of climate change. And all that power that is being played with here is causing us to plead for action today. I'm so honored to be with all of you guys here. Thank you for listening to my story, and I can't wait to meet some of you all.